It's important that we talk about all of the different variants of schizoid personality so that we can get a fuller and broader understanding. Schizoids tend to get bad rep in the press because of some notorious people who have developed maladaptive behaviors and gone on to commit heinous crimes. Now, they are in a tiny, 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 tiny percentage of people. However, there are people who are schizoid who do have psychopathic or develop psychopathic-like behaviors. We're not all angels. There's good and bad in every category. And some of the people with psychopathic traits aren't necessarily out there harming people. I'm back with another video, and today I'm going to be talking about 4 types of schizoid condition that was outlined by W.R.D. Fairbairn. He was one of the greatest contributors to the understanding of schizoid dynamics, and he has an interesting theory which is based on putting the level of schizoid ego splitting onto a spectrum. This will all become very clear as we go through the video. So the main types of schizoid condition that he outlined are as follows: schizophrenia proper, psychopathic personality of a schizoid type, which is the topic I'll be focusing on mainly in this video. Schizoid character, this is what I would say is like standard schizoid adaptations that will become clear later as well. And also the schizoid state or episode. So we'll get forward into this, starting with schizophrenia proper. The thing about schizophrenia, as with a lot of other different psychological disorders, is that it's still under research, and so the actual cause isn't entirely understood, and people tend to mistake the word schizoid for schizophrenia, but as you'll see in this video, there are 2 distinct different conditions. Fairbairn said that the contributing factors to schizophrenia were severe early trauma, emotional neglect or inconsistent caregiving. Disrupted attachment leads to ego splitting and fragmented self. With schizophrenia, the manifestations are withdrawal from reality, paranoia, hallucinations, impaired reality testing, which means an inability to tell what is real and what is imagined. There is emotional disconnection and disorganized thinking, and difficulty distinguishing between fantasy and external reality. This was in the 1950s that he wrote the book, and since then psychology and neuroscience has moved on some. The reason why he put the schizoid character on the spectrum with schizophrenia is because he believed there was an underlying link in terms of disruption in the caregiving process. He believed that there was a connection between early trauma and the development of schizophrenia. With modern psychology, that they have found that there are some shared genetic and developmental factors between schizoid tendencies and schizophrenia, but they are 2 distinctly different conditions. What they've discovered is that people have a genetic predisposition to develop schizophrenia. So what that means is that schizophrenia tends to run in families. Also, it can be linked to neurological abnormalities, such as differences in brain structure. It can be triggered by life circumstances as well, such as substance abuse, for example, psychoanalytic drugs or cannabis. And so Although it is on the spectrum in this video with the schizoid character, I needed to make the note that it doesn't mean that people with a schizoid character will develop from schizoid character into schizophrenia. Now we'll go on to explain the other types. I started off with schizophrenia proper because I needed to make the point of why it was on the spectrum, what Fairbairn thought at that time compared with where we are in modern times. And as I move forward onto the next two sections, what you'll see is that this is more like the schizoid dynamics that you're familiar with, and it's nothing to do with the psychosis element that Fairbairn was outlining. For someone to have schizoid dynamics, the primary defense is always withdrawal. And everybody who's on this spectrum that I'm talking about today has an underlying issue related to emotional detachment and withdrawal. I need to make the point that the psychopathic schizoid is not a clinical definition, and so that means it's not a term or a condition that you can get a formal diagnosis for. When understanding schizoid dynamics, it's important to understand that people can build different personality structures on top of that core. For example, Jeff Masterson identified two subtypes of people with schizoid dynamics. There are others, and one is a pseudo borderline and the other is a pseudo narcissistic. And superficially, these schizoid individuals look like they have borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder. But in reality, when you dig beneath those surface symptoms, they have an underlying schizoid dynamic taking place within their psychic structure. What all people with schizoid dynamics have in common is ego splitting, which is a division between a vulnerable self and the defensive self, emotional detachment, and this involves withdrawal, interpersonal disconnection, and that means difficulty forming relationships and putting the true self out there into the world to connect on a level with another person. And defensive strategies, which can involve the use of withdrawal, fantasy, and sometimes control in order to maintain a safe distance. As we know, with schizoid individuals, we keep our true self hidden and we operate in the world via a full self system. So we're not putting all of our true emotions, feelings, thoughts out there necessarily, and we can maintain a sense of distance and safety within social relationships. The schizoid state or episode. So Fairbairn talked about people can go through a temporary state of withdrawal. So they may go through ego splitting to detachment pain when they're going through turbulent times or difficulties, but this is only temporary. And after the stressor or whatever's making them feel that they need to detach from their emotions, after that stressor is removed, they can go back to their usual state of being. I think in his book he made the example of a teenager that might have a nervous breakdown because they're going through a transitional period and it's difficult, and they might go through a temporary withdrawal. That's quite straightforward, really. We'll move on to the psychopathic schizoid now. This is the main focus of the video, as I mentioned, as you can see on the title. Before I go into the contributing factors that lead to the development of someone being schizoid and also having some psychopathic traits, I need to make the point that there's different personalities within schizoid dynamics. People have different motivations, intentions, and so it's not necessarily the case that everyone who develops psychopathic traits as a schizoid is going to go out into the world and cause serious harm to people. So now I've got that out of the way, I'll go into explain what Fairbairn said about schizoids who develop psychopathic traits. The contributing factors are innate sensitivity, lack of parental attunement, growing up in a hostile environment, emotional neglect and relational trauma, having been through severe punishment, physical or emotional or sexual abuse. The thing about the psychopathic schizoid is that they've often grown up in harsh conditions. They were born with the propensity to develop schizoid traits. And then on top of that, they've often had to endure significant hardship. Now, what's hardship for one person and another person is going to vary. It depends on how the individual deals with their conditions. In this case, these individuals have developed extra defenses. So on top of the usual fantasy and withdrawal, they've had to develop means to control their external environment and people in it for their emotional safety. So this, for example, this could be someone who grew up in a household where they were being violently attacked and they had to learn to fight back, and because withdrawing and going into fantasy wasn't going to solve their problems, so they had to get physical. Or it could be someone who had a parent who was abusive, and the only way they could help to stem that abuse was to develop the habit of lying or manipulation to try to control the parent's behavior to lessen the abuse. There were like a lot of different ways that these schizoids could develop these additional defenses to help them to deal with their external environment. Also, there are aspects related to power dynamics. So if a person is brought up in an environment where the parent is very authoritarian, strict, laying down rules all of the time, the individual is going to see, or this learned behavior, they're going to learn that that's how they need to act to get by in that particular environment. So sometimes it can be the case that they're under the rule and they resent rules as a consequence. But in other cases, they can adopt that behavior pattern into their full self system and then execute that out into the world. Parentification can also play a part in a person developing these externalized defenses to deal with the world. With parentification, sometimes children are forced into a caregiving role or sort of a role with adult responsibilities. They might have to take care of younger siblings or even take care of the parent themselves. As a consequence of doing this, they're always having to be in a position where they're in charge, and this can lead them to learn that they need to develop controlling behaviors in order to manage people in the environment and to keep the chaos at bay. So I hope that's clear that the schizoid psychopath or the psychopathic schizoid is someone who, along with their original schizoid dynamics, adaptations, and defenses, has developed additional defenses in order to help them to deal with harsh or difficult or challenging environmental conditions. We'll go on to potential manifestations. So this is how the psychopathic schizoid may appear or behave or act as a consequence. So they can have a lack of adherence to society norms, little to no empathy, grandiosity in a sense of inner superiority, prioritizing their internal thoughts and fantasies over external relationships, use of manipulation, superficial charm, and also antisocial behaviors to manage relationships. They may have a rigid full self that hides emotional vulnerability, and that full self is going back to the aggressive, dominating parent that they may have internalized. And this is also linked to the masters and master slave theory. I have a video on that, and the master role. They may have a heightened dependence on external control, feeling they really need to control the environment. Their aggression is externalized through control or sometimes exploitation, and they have an increased risk for antisocial behaviors. I put a note on here because I think it's important to note that aggression doesn't always stem from anger. It can be cold, calculated, and based on achieving goals. The reason why I put that there is because with the emotional detachment and the lack of emotions, then that often will include anger. So it's not necessarily that this aggression is coming from an emotional place, but more from a psychological intention. And also the displays of aggression aren't necessarily coming from the heart, but more from learnt tactics that have been seen and internalized. We've now covered 3 of the 4 conditions outlined by Fairbairn. In the next video, I'm going to cover the schizoid character, and I'll be contrasting the schizoid character with the psychopathic schizoid. Additionally, I'm going to go on to compare the psychopathic schizoid with the classic psychopath and also antisocial behavioral disorder, so that you can see the differences between the different types of functioning. And I will see you in the next video.